Destruction is the highest tribute to hegemony. Because the progress of civilization often doesn't come from the old accepting new ideas, but from them being forced off the stage of history. 680 years ago, a black plague swept through Europe. At the cost of 1/3 of the population, this devastating disaster tore through Europe's 1200-year religious Iron Curtain. It tore open a rift. Over the next 300 years, the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and scientific revolution erupted from this rift. Western civilization, reborn from despair, burst forth with remarkable vitality. Then, Europeans spent another 300 years, with blood and cannons, spreading even deeper despair to other civilizations. All of humanity was inevitably drawn into a world order centered around Western civilization. This was the first true global order in human history. Some even believed it would be the last. However, the first global crisis of the new century put a huge question mark on this order. 260 million infected, 5.1 million dead. Frequent mutations of the COVID virus made the end of the pandemic seem distant. The world order dominated by the West. Does the Western-led world order really have the qualifications and the ability to lead human civilization into the future? Let's go back 680 years. Let's reassess the great disaster that shaped Western civilization. In 1348, Florence, Italy. A group of people, with their torsos bare, whipped their bodies with iron-studded whips while praying devoutly. They were mimicking Jesus being whipped. By actively abusing their own bodies, they hoped that the merciful Lord would lift his punishment on humanity. The Black Death was a terrifying disease. Patients would develop large black patches on their skin. This meant the bacteria had entered the bloodstream, causing massive tissue death. From the appearance of the black spots to death, it only took half a day. A few people could survive 2 or 3 days in bed. But this meant even greater misfortune, as it only added to the suffering. The Catholic Church declared to the world, the Black Death was God's punishment. So, in the early days of the Terror, Europeans became more devout in their faith in God. Encouraged by the Church, people began gathering at churches. They donated wealth or whipped themselves to seek forgiveness. However, the Black Death showed no signs of stopping. Soon, people found a new reason. The Jews, the group that had once been most eager to whip themselves, quickly became the most fanatical executioners. They prepared the most painful death for the Jews. Once again, history proved that those who are used to standing on moral high ground often commit the most vicious crimes because their fanaticism for righteousness exceeds their concern for humanity. Meanwhile, the streets of Florence were still littered with human and animal waste. Animal guts, rotting fish, spoiled shrimp, and drunkards' vomit filled the air with an indescribable stench. And the church believed that if someone spent too much time focusing on their body, they were driven by vanity and disloyal to God. Thus, personal hygiene was seen as a sign of irreverence. All of this created ideal conditions for the spread of the Black Death. The spread of the bacteria was so rapid that by afternoon, God's followers, who were busy gathering firewood in the morning, were meeting God himself by afternoon. In just 12 months, this terrifying disease took 80% of Florence's population. Panic filled the churches with people praying. They brought wealth to the clergy but also brought the plague. This turned priests into high-risk workers. Surviving priests abandoned their holy duties. The harsh pandemic caused the collapse of grassroots church organizations. People's faith finally began to crack. In the face of such despair, even the most devout had to choose between doubting God or doubting his teachings on earth. The radicals chose the former. They sparked the Renaissance and Enlightenment in Europe. Conservatives chose the latter, triggering the wave of the Reformation. The pain the Black Death caused Europe was so heavy that the cultural and intellectual revolution was full of rebellion from the start. Religion demanded the suppression of desires, and so nude statues rose in Florence's halls. Clergy were once the holy spokespersons, and so scandals of the clergy became the talk of the town. The survivors of the new era had two themes: how to freely enjoy the beauty of life before fate took it, and how to find the power of certainty in a chaotic world to protect themselves. These became the roots of Western humanism and scientific spirit. Europeans reborn from despair created a new image of humanity for themselves. They had independent free will, and through their own strength, they could self-protect, self-create, and self-achieve. Their life goal was no longer humility, but glory. 300 years after the plague, the spirit of Europeans had been completely transformed. The founder of experimental science, Francis Bacon, who served as the British Chancellor, could be said to represent this spirit. On one hand, he was calm, confident, and powerful. He declared that nature was like a shy maiden, and scientific experiments were about locking her in a room, interrogating her until she revealed her deepest secrets. On the other hand, he was full of greed, arrogance, and hypocrisy. As the chief prosecutor of the British Empire, Bacon was dismissed for corruption, but he argued that taking other people's money didn't affect his fairness in judgment. He wrote, "I know my hands are clean, my heart is clean, I just hope to have a clean big house to entertain my friends." The British poet Alexander Pope, his contemporary, called Bacon the smartest and most outstanding, yet also the most vile person he had ever met. This description could equally apply to 17th century Europe. It gave birth to countless brilliant minds in human history and advanced the progress of human civilization. However, when we shift our gaze from the homeland of Western civilization to its colonies, its extreme hypocrisy and barbaric nature were starkly exposed to the world. In 1600, the British East India Company was founded in London. It started a 274-year-long plunder of the world. In 1607, the Virginia Company fleet sailed into Chesapeake Bay. This marked the first successful British colony in North America, beginning the massacre of Native Americans. At the same time, the transatlantic slave trade reached its peak, a disaster that lasted over 400 years, costing Africa over 100 million lives. It can be said that the rise of Western civilization, led by America, is also a history of blood and tears for other peoples. In 1779, American founding father George Washington personally ordered the genocide of the Iroquois at their settlement. During the massacre of Native Americans, Washington told the troops, "The Native Americans are like wolves, both are predatory beasts. They are only different in form." These founding fathers, who wrote "All men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence, were nearly all large slave owners, with Washington and Jefferson being the largest. They served as the first and third presidents of the United States. After completing the most brutal plundering of other people's lands, natural resources, and personal freedoms, Western civilization passed through its most barbaric stage. Since modern times, Western countries abolished slavery and began pushing for equal rights movements. However, it wasn't because of sudden acts of kindness, but because more intensive industrial production required higher quality labor. Today, the essence of the International Division of Labor is still a financial and cultural colonial order led by the U.S. Economically, the U.S. plunders global wealth through excessive money printing to maintain its lavish lifestyle. Culturally, it monopolizes the interpretation of civilization's values, and militarily, it maintains overwhelming military power, ready to destroy any challenger at any moment. In this order, Western countries contribute the least labor but enjoy the best welfare, consuming the most resources on Earth. Moreover, they also stand on a moral high ground, depriving the rest of humanity of the right to pursue happiness. This parasitic, luxurious lifestyle has also backfired on Western people. They've lived in the sweet air of freedom for so long. They've long forgotten what hunger, suffering, and despair are. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they ignored the safety of vulnerable groups like the elderly and children, tearing off their masks and taking to the streets. They fought for the freedom to breathe, to gather, and to party. Soon, the COVID virus responded with cold numbers. Yet they didn't care at all. If the Black Death was nature's punishment for human ignorance, then COVID-19 is punishment for human arrogance. The Western world has indeed created unparalleled brilliance, but arrogance has turned them from a positive force driving civilization to a negative force holding it back. At this point, another civilization, one that has just gone through life and death struggles and understands the value of suffering and resilience, is needed. Only then can humanity be saved from deadly arrogance. This is the sacred mission given to this Eastern civilization by history. In the summer of 1989, American Francis Fukuyama offered the end of history thesis, suggesting that Western countries led by the U.S. represented the best and final form of human governance, the final form of human civilization. The same year, Eastern Europe underwent great changes. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and 7 other countries broke away from the Soviet Union. The following year, the Berlin Wall fell, and East and West Germany reunified. After a series of crises, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. It seemed like everything was validating Fukuyama's prophecy. This earned him tremendous fame. After the outbreak of COVID-19, French media asked Fukuyama whether his views had changed. Why did Western countries perform so poorly in handling the pandemic? Fukuyama responded, "I don't think the type of regime has anything to do with the effectiveness in handling the pandemic. The only exception is China. It could have done better, but it still has some doubts about providing data, and it also spread the virus outside its borders." As for why the US performed so poorly, Fukuyama blamed Trump for continuously downplaying the pandemic to maintain the ruler's prestige. In Fukuyama's view, this was just a minor historical anomaly. As long as a new president takes over, the US and the world order under its rule will get back on track. But how does the US-led world order perform beyond the pandemic? In 2010, global GDP was $66.16 trillion, and by 2020 it had grown to $84.71 trillion, an increase of $18.55 trillion. It seems like a lot, but out of this, the US grew by $5.95 trillion, and China grew by $8.63 trillion. Excluding the US and China, the world's GDP only grew by $3.97 trillion. This growth is even less than the amount of money the US prints in a year. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, the US printed about $10 trillion in 2020 alone. Entering 2021, Biden continued at full speed, printing another $5.8 trillion in just a few months. It can be said that the vast majority of economic growth in the past decade has been due to the US constantly printing money to buy cheap goods made in China. In the process, the consumption of natural resources, labor costs, and environmental destruction have all been paid for by China and the world. The US has become a financial parasite, sucking the life out of countries. And before the global economic system is completely destroyed, the US won't stop, because the US will use its powerful military to ensure that it is the last country to fall before it causes irreversible harm to humanity. Ending US hegemony is taking responsibility for the entire human civilization. History will prove that the so-called end of history is not the end of human history, but the end of Western-centered history. The wheels of civilization roll forward. The US has long been beyond repair. The US driver has done his duty. His historical mission is complete. It was once great. The greater America today is the one that has left the historical stage. In this sense, ending US hegemony is the highest tribute to it.